Quite a few years I taught a course on the cultural history of the Lake Superior region as part of a special program at the college called Superior Connections, which is an integrated curriculum for freshmen and sophomores where the lake and its region is the common text. And then we view that common material through different disciplinary lenses. So Tom Fitz teaches in it, and he teaches the geology of the region. Naturalists have taught natural history of the region, and I happen to teach a course on cultural history. And my areas of interest include comparative religion. So I would often talk about religion and the ways in which different religions come together through migration of populations, and the way in which that leads to either greater understanding or to a clash of cultures. And the failure of human communities to understand one another is often rooted in a failure to appreciate or understand the sources of meaning and purpose that people find in their lives. All of us long for some integrating sense of purpose and some kind of integrative sense of who we are in the world and what our proper relationships ought to be to one another and to the natural world. And in the very early experience of Aboriginal peoples, the Anishinaabe, and the European migrants, beginning with the French voyageurs and the Jesuits who accompanied them, we see this kind of interaction where very different worldviews come together. And that's the topic that I want to share with you tonight. This is part of a whole semester course, so I'll try to pare it down. I'm going to limit my remarks primarily to the experience of the Ojibwa. I sometimes refer to the people, the Aboriginal people here as Ojibwa, sometimes Anishinaabe. There are other tribes who are here, and I'll be referring to them as well, the Huron, the Ottawa or Odawa, Potawatomi, and so forth. But most of my references are to the Ojibwa. The title itself indicates representations of the Jesuits. They were referred to as black robes by the native peoples of the region for the attire that they wore. And the medicine wheel, of course, is an integrative symbol of the Ojibwa peoples. So, in talking about the Ojibwa, first of all, they belong to a larger group, an association of tribes that come together around a common language group. They're often called Algonquin tribes. The Algonquin language groups, and the historic range of the various tribal groups in the 16th and 17th centuries represented here in this map. There are Algonquin that extend even further north and west all the way up to James Bay, but this is a fair representation of the tribal ranges at the time of European contact. And you can see the area around Lake Superior here with the Ojibwa, and just a bit farther west the Saulteaux, who are also Ojibwa, who migrated further west in the historic migration. I'll be talking about that in just a little bit more. This is another rendering of the historic ranges then of the Algonquin language speaking groups. The Severin are an interesting group of people. I'll try not to digress too much or I'll go way too long, but they're interesting in that they're related to the Cree. And the Cree have also common roots with the Ojibwa, and in fact the language that modern day Severin or Cree speak is sometimes referred to as Ojibwe, the combination of Ojibwa and Cree languages. This is a pictograph. This is a modern pictograph by a contemporary Native American artist, but it uses the traditional symbols and shapes of the region common to pictographs of the 16th, 17th centuries and earlier. So this is a representation of Kichigami. That is the Great Lake. Kichi is great, Gami is lake or Lake Superior. And you can see the representations of the rapids of St. Mary, Sault Ste. Marie. Lake Michigan is represented by Mackinac Island. And you can see here Copper Harbor, an interesting rendering of the Keweenaw Peninsula. You can also see symbols of animals, the turtle, the crane, the bear, of course, and the wolf, Manong, on Isle Royal. You'll see here, this is a rendition of a megas shell. It's an actual shell that's found in Lake Superior in fresh water. And there are teachings about a great megas shell as a visionary appearance or apparition that led the Ojibwa people in a migration. Again, I'm going to say more about that in a little bit. But that led them finally to Moniwanakoning or Madeline Island. Moniwanakoning is perceived as the historic destiny of the Ojibwa people and their spiritual home. Jonathan Carver rendered this map. It was published in 1778, again just to give you an idea of the region, and you can see by 1778 the area is referred to as Chippewa territory, and the various ways that the islands are represented, not particularly accurate in proportion, but they've got the places there. You can see the Apostle Islands right here in the Bayfield Peninsula, Isle Royal or Manong, Island of the Wolf. And this is again the historic range of the Ojibwa people when the Europeans first began to travel into the western area of the Great Lakes. Oops, wrong button. And again, one more map of the region just to kind of locate what we're talking about here. This map is much later, and it shows the historic range of tribes at the time of the 19th century treaties, which established the reserves and the geographic boundaries for the various tribes. So you can see again Ojibwa and Ottawa or Odawa. You can see here the tribes of the Chequamegon area, Moniwanakoning, Madeline Island, and Red Cliff, Bad River, and where we are right here, the La Couture area of the Lake Superior region. All of these geographies had become the range of the Chippewa people or the Ojibwa nation in its various bands and tribes. The lifestyle of the Ojibwa continued in traditional, not only traditional lifestyles, but even including traditional architecture well into the 20th century. Not everyone is aware of that. So, for example, this photograph is 1923, Leech Lake, Minnesota, which is again part of the western edge of the Lake Superior bands of the Ojibwa nations. So the lifestyle that was guided by, again, religious views or worldviews were indelible and deep-seated in Native culture, even into the 20th century. I think it's important for us to remember that when we begin to talk about the differences in worldviews and foundational beliefs and sense of purpose and meaning in life, and how persistent and deep those values and ideas, philosophical and religious notions really were. Because this is after now several centuries of domination by first European and then later American culture. So again, just wanted to point out that kind of enduring way of life. So again, back to the region that we're looking at here. This is the area of exploration of the French fur traders. The early English colonies were established obviously in the Massachusetts Bay Area or Roanoke to the south, whereas the French were those Europeans who began to move westward and explore first with the St. Lawrence Seaway and then into the interior of the modern United States and to the north, Canada. What's interesting about this map, it was rendered in 1688. Just to give you some kind of historical framework, the Pilgrims land in Plymouth in 1620. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is roughly 1625, 1630. The French exploration of this region, well to the west of the English colonies that were just barely having a toehold on the Atlantic, coincides with that history of the Plymouth and Pilgrim communities. When we learn about American history, we learn about that Atlantic history. Very few people, including my students, know that the same years that we're talking about are the years of French exploration all the way into Madeline Island or Manawanakone. 1622, Etienne Brulé arrives on Lake Superior. The French were exploring the St. Lawrence Seaway decades before the British arrive at Plymouth. So all of this history is happening that we still don't teach as the history of contact between European explorers and native peoples. Very interesting. So this map, 1688, is also remarkable simply for its accuracy, partly because Vincenzo Coronelli never set a foot on the Western Hemisphere. He spent almost his entire life in Venice, Italy. He was a monk, and he drew his maps based on the records of the voyageurs and especially of Jesuit priests. Coronelli himself was a Jesuit, and the Jesuits were very, very good at record keeping. The Jesuit records are still famous as historic documents, and Coronelli used the reports of the Jesuit priests to create his maps. So as I mentioned, the Ojibwa and the Huron, the Odawa, the Potawatomi were living in this area some for many, many centuries. There are different renderings of the history of the migration. The Ojibwa people have a migration story. Some date their arrival in the western part of Lake Superior as early as the 14th century, 1320, some as late as 1480 or 1490. But certainly by the early 17th century, so 1600s, we begin to have encounters of European explorers and native peoples, the Anishinaabe. And among them, of course, are Champlain, Etienne Brulé, in this order, Jean Nicolet, and Pierre Radisson. We'll say just a brief word about the arrival of Europeans then. The French exploration of the Great Lakes begins with Jacques Cartier, 1534-35. Remember what I was saying? That's almost 100 years before the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Think about that. 100 years, almost 80 years or so, 90 years. Cartier certainly was in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and journeyed westward as far as Montreal, modern-day Montreal. He was searching for the legendary Northwest Passage. There were always rumors that there was a passage to China. If you could only cut through this big continent, you know, and bring those longboats, then surely riches would await those explorers. He was stymied at Montreal, modern-day Montreal, by the series of rapids and falls, and also the Iroquois tribe that controlled that area at that time, who were very wary of these Europeans who seemed to have their eyes on the prize of their own lands. And so Cartier did not journey farther than that. However, soon we do begin then to see the other explorers begin to arrive in this area. So in 1608, Champlain arrives, and he ascends the falls, and he establishes the city of Quebec. Champlain explored throughout the region, but especially Champlain was talented at bringing scouts who would go in advance of he would come and establish forts and communities, always accompanied by Jesuits. That's going to be key in this story. Always accompanied by the Jesuits. Not Franciscans yet, but Jesuits. And he also kept in his company some extraordinarily talented and ambitious, very brave scouts. Among them were Brulé, Nicolet, and then a little bit later is Radisson. Nicolet was one of the first to continue exploring farther inland, along with Brulé. I'll say a word about Brulé in just a minute, but I couldn't resist a little bit on Nicolet because he's kind of a character. This is an artist's rendering, but he was famous for always carrying 2 pistols. And when he would arrive at an Indian village or encampment, in the canoe, he'd step out and fire both barrels. And you show here the various reactions in this artist's rendering. But he arrives in modern-day Wisconsin. He's probably the first to step foot in modern-day Wisconsin. He comes to Red Banks, Lake Michigan, near modern-day Green Bay. In 1634. He was also noted for his attire. He wore flowing robes with as much red and gold as he could get, and flamboyant hats, and he tried to represent himself as royalty, which in fact he was regarded often by the Aboriginal peoples.
Well, he got their attention.
Yeah, he did get their attention. So, and it's interesting to note how he's portrayed. So this is another portrait of Nicolet, where you can see, again, this is an artist's rendering, but here the natives, some are running in fear at what seemed like perhaps a spirit or a god, and others bow before him. That says a lot, not only about Nicolet, but about the legends that accrue to the voyageurs and to the French as they explore, that they are more than conquerors, that they are entitled, almost deified in their entitlement to the lands. Wherever they step foot, that now is New France. Doesn't matter who was there before them or how long. Brulé, I mentioned him before I talk a little bit more about the Jesuits in the Chequamegon Bay region. Brulé continues farther west, actually, than Nicolet. Nicolet begins to curve and travel south from Red Bank, but Brulé continues westward. We know that he was at the St. Mary's Rapids in 1622, so 12 years before Nicolet was in Green Bay. And he seems to have traveled up the north shore at least a ways. That's where the legends start to get unclear. How far did Brulé travel? There are some legends among the Ojibwa of white men as far as the western end of Lake Superior as early as 1612. That's possible. I don't think that, well, in fact, we know that couldn't have been Brule, but it is possible that there were others that were pressing further westward, primarily looking for the Northwest Passage. But already by 1622, Brule began to see that the real treasure, the real gold, was fur. And the fur trade began to really take off with Brule and Nicolet, and then finally it culminates in the explorations of Radisson and Groseilliers. These are significant figures in the western history of the Lake Superior region. So Radisson and Groseilliers arrived in the Chequamegon Bay in 1659. This is a firm date. We know that this is true. We know that they were there. And they arrive and establish a fort on the shores of Chequamegon Bay near Fish Creek. In fact, probably very near the modern Maslowski's Beach. So if you go to that flowing well, that artesian, that may well be where Radisson drank artesian water. That artesian's been there long before Radisson. Radisson also, along with his brother-in-law, Groseilliers, they establish a fort, but they have a real rough time in the winter, and so they press inland to get away from the oppressive winds of the lake in the winter months, and they arrive at, first of all, Lake Owen. And then they establish a winter camp on modern-day Lake Nemacolin, right at the outflow. And they're befriended by Ojibwa. The Ojibwa are here. There's a Huron village and an Ottawa village on Chequamegon Bay. But here they find Ojibwa, and the Ojibwa welcome them and feed them. And in fact, in the spring, after a very difficult winter, they have a feast of the stores that the Ojibwa had laid for the winter. There was enough food that they would have a Thanksgiving feast in 1660, the spring of 1660, for the Europeans, mimicking the first Thanksgiving story of the Puritans. Really kind of a lovely event in the history of this region, so that there is an tribal feast for these Europeans who have survived the winter with them. And Radisson then goes back to the Chequamegon Bay and builds a second fort on the western tip of what today is called Long Island. However, he abandons that fort in just a year. So you have the explorers coming in, establishing temporary sites, significant encounters with native people, but then abandoning these posts for various reasons that, again, I can't get into that, or it'd be a long digression. Radisson was a bit of a rascal. One other feature of the exploration of Radisson and Groseilliers, again, they are accompanied by Jesuits. The Coureurs de Bois, the voyageurs, and the fur hunters do not like Jesuits. For one, the Jesuits were scolding them for drinking and the excesses of voyageur culture, but also because ultimately the Jesuits controlled the fur trade. It was the Jesuits, by order of the French crown, that had control of the ebb and flow of furs. It would always end up at Montreal. It's estimated that in the 1660s, 70s, and 80s, the Jesuit order controlled 90% of the fur trade in North America. So when Radisson returned to Montreal in 1661, he had boatloads of furs that were confiscated by the provincial New French governor in Montreal on behalf of the Jesuits. Now, Radisson got so ticked off that he he took off for the West again and betrayed the French supporters and sided with the English and helped establish a rival company that came to be known as the Hudson's Bay Company. That was Radisson. Well, as I mentioned, the Jesuit missionaries accompanied the voyageurs throughout, and the Jesuits were an order of monks and priests who were dedicated like no others to missionary ventures. It is the missionary order of the Roman Catholic Church. I want to say just a brief word about the Jesuits because it's significant to understand then what's going to happen between the Ojibwa people or the Anishinaabe and this version of Christianity. The Jesuit order was established by St. Ignatius Loyola, you can see in 1539, about the same time, by the way, as Cartier was exploring up toward Montreal. The other significant date, around 1539, is it's in the heart of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in Europe. And the Jesuit order was established as a counter to the Protestant Reformation, specifically as a missionary order, a teaching order, but as a very aggressive counter, again, to the Protestant Reformation. St. Ignatius Loyola is portrayed here in two ways. I wanted to show you the black robe, which became the signature. The signatures of the Jesuit order of that time